welcome back to Doug Pagitt Radio. My name's Tony Jones. I'm the guest host this week on AM 950, and I'm joined in the studio by the sidekick John Music.
Hello, everybody.
And on the line, we have Randy Balmer. Randy is a highfalutin Ivy League professor. No, he's not that highfalutin.
With roots in Minnesota, I need to point that out.
Yeah, you know, we do reach some people in Michelle Bachmann's district. You'll be happy to know.
Okay.
So you may be, Michelle Bachmann may be listening to you, Randy. Now is your...
Well, I'd be happy to talk to her.
I imagine. Now's your time.
Hey, Randy, I got a question for you. How was it growing up in the shadow of your brother, Steve Balmer? No relation?
I keep sending him birthday cards, but they keep getting returned.
Okay.
And he spells it with two L's, and I'm with one
I
L,
see.
so.
Okay.
They must have changed that at Ellis Island or something.
Yeah.
That's where the families
Right.
diverged. So before I've got the perfect setup question for you, but before I ask you this question, we're switching from talking about President Obama and his Niebuhrian Christian realism in the last segment to our four remaining presidential candidates on the Republican side, none of whom I think you could say is a Christian realist. And but first, establish your evangelical street cred for us a little bit, because I know I've even talked to you about this in the past. You are maybe somebody would hear you talk or see you on The Daily Show or read something you've written and would say, boy, I'm surprised to see him on the masthead of the Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of evangelicalism. So how'd that happen?
Well, I for a long time I was writing a lot of feature articles for Christianity Today. I was doing about at least one a year, and then a new editor came in and decided he didn't like me so much for whatever reason. So I haven't been writing lately for them.
You're not bitter at all, are you, Randall?
Well, it's a longer conversation.
Okay.
In terms of my evangelicalism, it's part of who I am. I gave my heart to Jesus in the parsonage of the East Chain Evangelical Free Church in southern Minnesota, 6 miles north of the Iowa border.
Yeah.
At the age of 3, and my father was a minister for 40 years in the Evangelical Free Church, and it's very much in my bones. It's who I am. And what I've been trying to do over the last few years is, in my judgment, call evangelicals back to their heritage, call evangelicals back to their better selves. When I study American religious history, not even to mention the New Testament, which is an even larger authority, of course. When I study American religious history, I see that evangelicals were very much involved on the part of those on the margins of society, particularly in the 19th century and the antebellum period, in pushing for equal rights for women, and including voting rights, and pushing for prison reform. The whole notion of confinement not merely being separation from the rest of society, but a place where a prisoner could become penitent, which is where we get the term penitentiary. That was very much an evangelical idea in the 19th century. The crusade against slavery, obviously, but even the temperance movement was a response to very, very real social problems in the 19th century. And when I look around today at the machinations of the religious right, I simply don't see those sorts of concerns reflected.
Yeah.
What I take away from the 19th century evangelical activism is that evangelicals invariably took the part of those on the margins of society, and I simply don't see that emphasis today. That's my calling.
There was this very I don't know if you remember this, but many years ago, Jim Wallace and Jerry Falwell used to kind of have this dog and pony show where they would go and debate each other, and they were debating each other on Meet the Press with Tim Russert one time. And, Jim was Jim Wallace of Sojourners, a kind of progressive social activist. He was arguing that he was, he's an evangelical. And Jerry, just as Tim Russert was cutting him off and going to commercial, Jerry Falwell famously said, "Jim Wallace, you're about as evangelical as an oak tree." And, here's the thing, though, Randy, is you and I both, I don't, here's what I think. Evangelicalism, you and I argue, and Jim Wallace, other people argue, look, this is a way of being that understands the New Testament in a particular way. But the fact is, the way that the mainstream media uses evangelical and the way it's used in popular culture, it's a cultural category, right? It's a psychographic. Yeah. It's not a theographic anymore. It's who do you listen to as your authority? Do you listen to Jim Dobson? Do you listen to Christian radio? Do you go to an evangelical church? Like, that's the signifier. And so a lot of people would say, like, look, Randy, you're an Episcopal priest. You're not an evangelical. You don't get to say you're an evangelical anymore. So how do you, briefly, how do you respond to that? And then I want to ask you about these Republicans.
Okay, well, actually, there is a brief way to respond to that, other than to say that I very much am an evangelical, and it's part of my DNA. It's part of who I am.
Yeah.
And I desperately want to reclaim evangelicalism for the principles that I see encoded into the New Testament and the principles that I saw acted out in the 19th century and even well into the 20th century until the rise of the religious right in the late 1970s.
Yeah. So here's my question for you as an observer of American evangelicalism. I think we're seeing the answer. I think the answer even came yesterday in the I don't know if it was a primary or caucus in Kansas. But who are evangelicals less likely to vote for? A serial adulterer, a Catholic, or a Mormon? I mean, right? Like, who do they have most antipathy toward? And it seems to me like evangelicals, and I've been making this argument on this radio show actually for the last several months. Evangelicals have a deep antipathy toward Mormons, and I think a lot of them. I remember I didn't even grow up in an evangelical church, and I remember in Larson's Book of Cults, which my youth pastor had. And I grew up in a mainline church, and Mormonism is a cult. And I think that's so deeply embedded in evangelicals over the age of 40, 45. I don't think they can vote for Romney.
I think that's right, and I think if he does emerge as a nominee, which I guess the betting is that he will, I think that you'll have a lot of evangelicals who will probably vote for him. But to me, the real question is, will they invest the kind of passion and time and energy into seeing him elected that they would for Mike Huckabee, just to take an example out of the air. And I guess I have some serious doubts about that. And I want them to. My plea would be for them to consider seriously the other ticket, and I think that I would argue, and I'm prepared to argue, that the values reflected there are much more New Testament values than I see on the Republican side.
It's interesting. I think part of Obama's success was that he peeled off just enough evangelicals under the age of 40 in the last election, right, to damage that voting bloc. And I don't know if you remember, but Donald Miller, who's a very popular author, wrote Blue Like Jazz, and in kind of my cohort of 40-ish, emergent-y type missional Christians, he was out stumping for Obama, which I think cost him probably some book sales in the evangelical world, but that's how passionately he felt about it. And I don't know if younger evangelicals, I think you're right, that if Romney's the nominee, that, yes, he'll carry the evangelical vote, but a lot of people will just stay home. But I wonder if young evangelicals will just stay home if Obama is not actively courting them like he did 4 years ago. And here we are, it's March, and I don't see the Obama administration actively courting younger evangelicals again.
Well, I don't have any inside track on that, so I really don't know. I'd be surprised if he didn't. I think the campaign is pretty sophisticated about such things, and I think they do have a case to make. What I saw in 2008 was the real generational divide among evangelicals between the old line folks, people like Tony Perkins and Dobson and Chuck Colson and so forth, Don Wildman, who kept insisting throughout the campaign that the only salient moral issues were abortion and same-sex marriage, and the younger cohort, the people you were talking about, including yourself, Tony, testimony, who said, and folks who are even younger than you, I guess there are a few perhaps who are, and what they kept saying is, no, wait a minute, morality has a much wider spectrum than merely abortion and same-sex marriage. Let's talk about poverty. Let's talk about hunger. Let's talk about AIDS. Let's talk about torture. Let's talk about these two reckless wars that the previous administration got us into, and let's talk about morality in a broader sense. And I think that's what happened. And you're right, Obama was able to reel in a lot of these younger generation evangelicals, whereas the older generation kept saying that abortion, same-sex marriage are the only issues we care about.
So now let's say, let's follow this path for a minute or two here in our last couple of minutes. Say Romney gets the nomination. Are people just going to open up, is the mainstream media going to really start to out some of the practices of the Church of Latter-day Saints that many Americans will find strange or distasteful? Do you see that on the horizon?
I don't know if the media is going to do that. I think it probably will begin to come out because people are curious. And you know, I've been studying Mormonism for 25, 30 years now. I'm utterly fascinated by it. I teach courses on it, including up at Dartmouth. I've taught several courses there, and I will again. I'm utterly fascinated by it, so I think people will ask questions. And I think part of Romney's problem is he's been so secretive about it. Yeah, he keeps dodging around. The standard answers are, I don't speak for my church. I'm not a theologian. And I think what's hurt him politically about that is that evasiveness merely reinforces the image that many people already have of him, namely that he is evasive, that he's willing to kind of dance around various issues. I think he would be much better advised to address it forthrightly and say, yes, I'm a Mormon. My family's been Mormon for generations. This is how I understand myself. This is how I understand my place in the world, my responsibility to others. I'm not going to back away from my faith, even though I acknowledge that other people are not comfortable with it. I think if he had done that, especially if he had done it 4 years ago, he'd be in much better shape than he is today. But he keeps being evasive about it.
Yeah, it is funny. I've noticed that very same thing, and he seems to be. There's fear, I think, because I think he and his advisors know that a lot of Americans are going to find some of the practices of Mormonism very curious. And
there's no question that they are. They are. There's no question. I mean, it's really I'll just say interesting and not use a judgmental word here. It's interesting stuff, and I think as it begins to kind of percolate to the surface, what I worry about as somebody who takes seriously the notion of pluralism and multiculturalism, and respect for others, and respect for the religious traditions, what I worry about is that any treatment absent Romney's own addressing of the issue, which he has not done, in my judgment, any treatment is going to be sensationalistic and almost lurid, and that, I think, is a disservice to everybody.
Randy Balmer, it's so great. I wish we had more time with you. I'm going to be watching to see what you write about this upcoming election. I think it's going to be another fascinating election where intersection of religion and presidential politics comes into play. Randy Balmer has been our guest the last couple segments. He's a professor at Columbia, leaving for Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, and author of God in the White House and The Making of Evangelicalism and lots of other books. You're listening to AM 950.
We will not be an easy target.